every time the Bible is taken out of context. A verse gets quoted, shared online, printed on a coffee mug, turned into a rule, a promise, or a life motto, and no one notices it's been ripped from its original setting. When that happens, the Bible doesn't just lose detail. It ends up saying something it was never meant to say. Entire belief systems get built on a single sentence, while the surrounding passage disappears. The original audience fades. The historical moment vanishes. This isn't rare. It happens every single day. And it quietly reshapes how people understand faith, judgment, suffering, and hope. Someone opens the Bible, finds a verse that fits the moment, shares it, repeats it, builds a belief around it, but the pages before and after remain unread. A single sentence lifted from Scripture becomes a standalone truth. The surrounding paragraphs disappear. What remains is a fragment that sounds biblical, but means something the original writer never intended. Context isn't decoration, it's the foundation. And every time it's removed, the verse doesn't just lose detail, it often gains a completely different meaning. Take Matthew's warning about judgment. The verse says not to judge, clear, direct, except the passage continues. Just verses later, it gives instructions about removing a speck from someone's eye after addressing the log in one's own. The teaching isn't never evaluate anyone. It's evaluate yourself first, then help others with clarity. Without context, the verse becomes a shield against all discernment. With context, it becomes a call for honest, humble assessment. The Bible didn't change. The reading did. Or the verse about doing all things through Christ. It appears on athletic gear, in business seminars, on motivational posters. The context? Paul was in prison, describing how he'd learned to survive both plenty and scarcity. He wasn't celebrating victories. He was explaining endurance through hardship. The verse gets quoted for winning. It was written about surviving. Same words, opposite application, all because the context was left behind. Then there's Jeremiah's promise about plans for a future and hope, printed on graduation cards, quoted during career transitions, claimed as personal prophecy, but Jeremiah was writing to exiles in Babylon, people who'd lost their homes, their temple, their nation. And the promise included a timeline, 70 years. Most of them wouldn't live to see it fulfilled. That's the context. Not immediate blessing. Long-term faithfulness through prolonged suffering. The promise stands, but it's a promise about purpose during exile, not exemption from it. Every time the context disappears, the verse becomes something it never was. This pattern repeats throughout Scripture. What was said to a specific people in a specific moment becomes a universal promise, applied to entirely different situations. And the consequences aren't small. When context is removed, expectations change. Someone reads a promise of prosperity and believes hardship means they lack faith. They sit in silence, questioning why their prayers go unanswered while others seem blessed. Someone reads about judgment and thinks discernment is forbidden. Someone reads about strength and interprets struggle as failure. They carry the weight alone, convinced that doubt means defeat. The text becomes a mirror reflecting what the reader wants to see rather than what was actually written. The issue isn't the verses themselves, it's the way they're being read. Or more accurately, the way they're not being read. Isolated from their surrounding text, separated from their original audience, divorced from the narrative they're embedded in. The Bible wasn't written in standalone sentences. It's letters to communities facing specific challenges, historical accounts of nations in crisis, poetry expressing raw emotion, prophecy addressing particular moments in time. Each verse exists within layers of context that shape its meaning, Genre matters, audience matters, historical moment matters. The verses before and after matter. Strip those away and the text doesn't just lose nuance, it often says the opposite of what it meant. A warning becomes permission. A description of endurance becomes a promise of success. A long-term hope becomes an immediate guarantee. And the people reading these verses looking for guidance, comfort, understanding, end up building their faith on interpretations the original writers would barely recognize. It's not that the readers are being careless. Often they're taught to read this way. Memorize verses, quote scripture, apply it to daily life. All good practices in theory, but when the emphasis stays on isolated verses without ever returning to their context, the entire framework becomes unstable. Because the Bible wasn't designed to function as a collection of independent statements, the meaning emerges from the whole, the story arc, the theological development, the way themes build and echo and resolve across books and centuries. Consider the verse about asking and receiving. Sounds transactional outside its context. Request made, blessing delivered. But the surrounding passage compares the divine to a parent who gives what's truly needed, not just what's requested. The verse is about relationship and trust, not transactions. Different context, different meaning entirely. Perhaps what gets lost most in decontextualized reading is this: the Bible wasn't written to be quoted, it was written to be understood. Not as a collection of isolated promises, but as a complete revelation. Stories that build on each other. Teachings that require their surrounding framework. Every time a verse gets pulled from its context, something essential disappears. Not just historical detail or literary background, but the actual meaning itself. These verses still carry truth when read fully, but it's often a different truth than the fragments suggest. More complex, more challenging, less immediately comforting, but more ultimately honest about struggle, faith, and the nature of divine promises. The question isn't whether isolated verses can help people. They do. But there's depth available in the complete passages that the isolated versions can't provide. Layers of meaning that only emerge when the context returns, when verses are read as they were written, in their original framework with their intended audience in mind. The full story changes everything. Not because the words are different. Context is what gives words their true meaning. Lose it, and what remains might sound biblical, even inspiring. But it won't be the truth that was.